Adolf Hitler's health and habits have long been subjects of historical inquiry, yet one detail often overlooked reveals more than his speeches or military orders ever could: the way he slept, or rather, failed to. Sleep, for Hitler, became both refuge and torment. His irregular hours, dependence on stimulants, and late-night routines reflected the growing instability of his mind and body during the height and decline of the Third Reich. By tracing the evolution of his sleep patterns, historians uncover a clinical portrait of a leader whose waking world had become increasingly detached from reality. In the early years of his rule, Hitler maintained a nocturnal schedule. He was known to remain awake until 3 or 4 in the morning, often dictating speeches or reviewing propaganda films. The mornings were spent sleeping well into midday, sometimes later. This inverted rhythm was tolerated, even accommodated, by his subordinates, who adjusted their own routines around his. What began as an eccentricity evolved into a defining feature of his leadership. The government of Nazi Germany, to a significant extent, functioned according to the sleep cycle of one man. The consequences of this schedule extended beyond inconvenience. Hitler's tendency to hold meetings late into the night placed immense strain on his military advisors, who were often forced to make critical decisions while fatigued. Strategic discussions that determined the fate of entire campaigns were conducted when both leader and staff were operating under exhaustion. The imbalance between day and night mirrored the psychological imbalance that would later characterize Hitler's wartime behavior: isolation, paranoia, and disconnection from practical reality. By the late 1930s, insomnia had become a chronic feature of his life. Those within his inner circle reported that he would wander his quarters restlessly, reading or pacing for hours, unable to settle. He was said to avoid sleeping before dawn, describing the night as a time when his mind would not stop. His physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, prescribed various sedatives to induce rest, but these often produced limited or inconsistent results. Instead, they deepened his dependence on medication, creating a cycle of artificial stimulation and chemical fatigue that eroded his natural rhythms. Morell's treatment regimen soon became central to Hitler's existence. He administered a wide range of substances, vitamins, hormones, and stimulants, some of which contained methamphetamine derivatives. Hitler's day began with injections designed to energize him, followed by pills intended to calm him later. This pattern of artificial wakefulness and forced sleep left his body in constant imbalance. By the early 1940s, eyewitnesses described him as both energetic and frail, alternating between manic bursts of confidence and prolonged periods of lethargy. His insomnia was no longer merely a symptom, but a defining expression of his psychological decline. As the war intensified, so too did the effects of this disordered lifestyle. During the early campaigns, particularly the invasions of Poland and France, Hitler appeared at the height of his vitality. He was described as tireless, alert, and precise in decision-making. Yet by the time of the Soviet invasion in 1941, his habits had turned against him. He often slept through critical hours of battle, awakening late in the day to issue orders disconnected from the current situation. Commanders in the field waited for instructions that never came, or came too late. Fatigue had begun to distort not only his judgment, but the coordination of the German war effort. In the Führer headquarters, where Hitler relocated for much of the war, his nocturnal lifestyle grew more extreme. Meetings frequently began after midnight and lasted until dawn. Generals and ministers, some too afraid to show discomfort, endured these sessions in silence. Hitler's refusal to adapt his schedule to the rhythm of the war front led to delays in communication and confusion among his staff. The night became his domain, a psychological refuge from the pressures of daylight. It was in these hours that he issued his most rigid, impulsive, and disconnected commands. Sleep deprivation is known to amplify emotional instability, impair reasoning, and reduce the ability to assess risk. Hitler displayed all of these traits in his later years. His outbursts became more unpredictable, his faith in intuition over logic more pronounced. He interpreted setbacks not as the result of flawed strategy, but as evidence of betrayal or weakness among his subordinates. This pattern of thinking, deeply reinforced by exhaustion and chemical dependence, eroded his capacity for rational command. In effect, the dictator's war against sleep mirrored his war against reality itself. Those who observed him closely noticed that his physical deterioration was synchronized with his sleep problems. His complexion turned pale, his movements slowed, and tremors began to affect his hands. The long nights and erratic drug use aggravated symptoms consistent with cardiovascular strain and neurological decline. Morell's efforts to sustain him through pharmacological means produced only temporary relief. Hitler's reliance on injections and pills was so extensive that by 1944, he could scarcely function without them. The very substances intended to maintain his control had become a quiet instrument of his collapse. By the middle of the war, Hitler's daily schedule had diverged completely from that of his generals. While most of Germany's military apparatus operated on a conventional timetable, Hitler awoke in the afternoon and retired near dawn. This meant that urgent reports arriving in the morning could remain unread for hours, sometimes till the following night. Commanders at the front learned to delay their communications, anticipating his waking hours. The result was a distorted flow of information, in which the realities of the battlefield were constantly filtered through the lateness of his routine. The psychological consequences of isolation and insomnia converged. Hitler's interactions became increasingly limited to a small circle of loyal subordinates, many of whom reinforced his worldview rather than challenge it. The lack of sleep intensified his irritability and distrust. He began to perceive disagreement as disloyalty and hesitation as sabotage. The combination of exhaustion and paranoia produced an atmosphere of tension even among his closest aides. Conversations were cautious, tone measured, as those around him attempted to navigate the unpredictable temperament of a sleepless ruler. By 1944, as the war turned decisively against Germany, the effects of this mental and physical deterioration became undeniable. Hitler's decision-making had grown erratic. He dismissed sound military advice, clung to unrealistic counteroffensives, and demanded operations that his armies no longer had the means to execute. Witnesses from this period describe him as alternating between manic determination and visible despair. The inability to rest, physically or psychologically, left him trapped in a state of perpetual agitation. His sleep, when it occurred, was brief and fragmented, providing no real recovery from the strain of his circumstances. In the final months of the war, the boundaries between Hitler's waking and sleeping life all but disappeared. The bunker beneath Berlin, where he spent his last weeks, existed in a permanent state of artificial light and noise. The bombardment above provided no silence, the air no freshness. He slept sporadically, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, often interrupted by news of defeats or desertions. The insomnia that had once seemed a quirk of temperament had now consumed him entirely. His body and mind, deprived of natural rhythm and rest, mirrored the disintegration of the regime he had created. In the final phase of Hitler's life, the psychological toll of exhaustion became unmistakable. Those within the Führerbunker described a man whose capacity for coherent focus was rapidly diminishing. His speech was slower, his eyes unfocused, and his responses often delayed, as though separated from the present by an invisible barrier. The habitual nocturnal rhythm persisted even in the bunker. Meetings still began late at night, though the war outside had long ceased to follow his schedule. While the rest of Berlin endured bombardment and fire, Hitler continued to operate in temporal isolation, detached from both daylight and defeat. Eyewitnesses noted that his periods of wakefulness were marked by restlessness and pacing. He would wander the concrete corridors, muttering to himself or engaging in repetitive gestures, straightening objects, adjusting papers, or reviewing maps that no longer represented reality. This behavior was not the product of simple anxiety. It reflected a nervous system under chronic strain. Years of disrupted sleep and chemical dependency had eroded his ability to regulate mood or sustain concentration. His existence had become a continuous twilight, alternating between bursts of agitation and near catatonic withdrawal. Sleep deprivation also impaired Hitler's sense of time and proportion. He began to view events through a distorted lens, perceiving minor developments as decisive and ignoring major catastrophes altogether. Reports of Allied advances were dismissed as exaggerations, while rumors of miraculous counterattacks were accepted without question. The collapse of rational evaluation, a hallmark of sleep-induced cognitive decline, was evident in his insistence that armies long destroyed still existed and that victories could be achieved through sheer willpower. In these delusions, fatigue and ideology had fused completely. By April 1945, the medical effects of prolonged insomnia were unmistakable. His complexion had turned gray, his posture stooped, and his movements were marked by tremors so pronounced that he struggled to control even simple gestures. Observers recorded that he appeared decades older than his actual age. His eyes, once described as piercing and animated, now appeared dull and glassy. He relied on constant medication from Dr. Morell, though by this time, even Morell's interventions failed to restore clarity or energy. The physician himself was dismissed in the final days, after accusations that his treatments were poisoning the Führer, a final irony in a life sustained by chemical illusion. The link between Hitler's mental decline and his sleep deprivation offers a crucial psychological insight into the nature of his leadership. Fatigue diminishes empathy, impairs memory, and heightens irritability, all traits evident in Hitler's late war persona. His interactions with subordinates became increasingly accusatory and fragmented. He lashed out at generals for imaginary disloyalties and berated aides for trivial mistakes. The more exhausted he became, the more absolute his certainty grew. The absence of rest did not humble him, it amplified his delusions of control. As the Allied forces closed in on Berlin, Hitler's routine dissolved entirely. Reports from those present describe him sleeping at irregular intervals, sometimes collapsing in his chair, sometimes retiring for brief periods only to awaken abruptly. He consumed sweets and tea to maintain wakefulness, occasionally resorting to stimulants that no longer produced effect. The bunker, sealed from natural light, had become a physical manifestation of his psychological condition, airless, confined, and detached from time. The days and nights merged into a single unbroken vigil. During this period, he continued to deliver monologues that stretched late into the night. These speeches, directed to secretaries or officers, repeated themes of betrayal, destiny, and endurance. They revealed a mind oscillating between clarity and confusion. At times, his recollection of past events was precise. Moments later, his narrative drifted into fantasy. Historians analyzing these accounts note that the lack of sleep and the isolation of command created a feedback loop. His thoughts became trapped within their own echo, untested by external reality. By the final week of April, the physiological exhaustion was total. Hitler's body could no longer sustain prolonged wakefulness, yet true sleep eluded him. The noises of bombardment above and the claustrophobic environment below ensured that even brief periods of rest were shallow and dreamlike. Witnesses described him as muttering in his sleep, occasionally shouting orders or names from the past. The line between dream and waking command had blurred completely. The dictator, who once controlled armies across Europe, could now command only the shadows in his mind. This state of deterioration carried symbolic weight. The man who sought to control every aspect of his environment had lost mastery over the most basic function of life, rest. His mind, deprived of renewal, turned inward, replaying fragments of speeches and betrayals. The world outside, the real world of armies, cities, and people, had receded beyond reach. The destruction of the Reich thus paralleled a personal implosion, a biological and psychological collapse that mirrored the ruin of his ambitions. On April 29th, Hitler dictated his final testament, a document notable for its mixture of defiance and delusion. He blamed the war's failure on others, denied wrongdoing, and framed his impending death as an act of loyalty to his vision. It was composed during one of his last lucid intervals, possibly following a rare, brief rest. Yet even in this moment, the exhaustion is evident in the disjointed tone and erratic sequencing of thought. The text reads less as strategy than as confession, a final attempt to impose order on a disordered mind. The following day, April 30th, Hitler retreated to his private quarters. The accounts of his final hours vary, but all agree on the atmosphere of fatigue and inevitability. He moved slowly, spoke softly, and appeared detached from his surroundings. In the silence that followed, punctuated only by distant artillery, he ended his life. The man who had spent years avoiding the vulnerability of sleep found in death, the only form of rest that remained. In the aftermath, those who emerged from the bunker described an overwhelming sense of release. Not relief, but exhaustion. The entire apparatus of the Third Reich had been sustained by the will and rhythm of one individual. With his death, that rhythm stopped. The nocturnal habits, the sleepless vigils, and the manic decision-making ceased abruptly, leaving behind a structure incapable of independent function. It was as though the machinery of the state had been deprived of its final source of energy. From a historical and psychological perspective, Hitler's sleep patterns are more than a biographical curiosity. They reveal the inner mechanics of power and decline, the interplay between biology and ideology. The inability to rest became a metaphor for the regime itself, relentless, unstable, and self-destructive. In the end, the same forces that drove his sleepless ambition also ensured his undoing. His body, his mind, and his empire all followed the same trajectory: expansion without balance, motion without rest, and collapse without recovery.